Good. Uh, welcome to the Healthy Planet Action Coalition meeting with Dr. Peter Ward of the University of Washington. Peter is the author of this book, Under a Green Sky, which I just read recently, and it prompted me to contact Peter because of his expertise in the history of extinctions. And having read his co-authored book, Rare Earth, Why Complex Life is Uncommon in the Universe, many years ago, I've got great admiration for Peter, and he's joining us today to talk about sea level rise. So I'll hand over to Peter and allow him to introduce himself further.
Well, thank you so much. I'm glad to have the opportunity. I really should cede the entire screen to John, who knows a whole lot more about sea level rise than I do. But nevertheless, in my laptop here, right behind it, I decided to pull up what's the latest estimate. And again, after all the years of so many of us trying to tell people what's about to happen, what is happening, and what will continue to happen, the estimates keep getting more dire. So right now, and if you just asked Mr. Google, what is the most recent estimate for the US, it's looking at 0.3 meters by 2050, and that's for the East Coast. But then another meter in the next 50 years after that. But I think we'll all find out those are woeful underestimates because of the subsidence of coastlines taking place. What I've tried to tell audiences, and John will, I'm sure, back me up on this, is at least to me, the greatest problem, danger, threat facing humanity comes from sea level rise affecting rice crops and other very low areas of agriculture. And secondly, sea level rise affecting transportation. So it's not just you're going to lose crops because of salinization, you're going to lose the ability to transport them. I live in Washington State, and like so many of the United States, the railroad systems here bought up as much of as close to sea level land as they could. And so we have these big north-south passages along the inland sea we call the Salish Sea, that's lined by railroads. And of course, right next to the railroads are the highways. But it's not just the flooding of the railroads, but the storm surge affecting them. And also, as we're seeing with pluvial events becoming more and more frequent, we're getting the cliffs, which are glacial where I live, spilling onto the railroads. So we're getting it for two directions, really: more rainfall, rising sea level. And so again, my fear is so much dealing with loss of crops, but also even the crops that are there, how do you get them from farmer to market? So these, at least to me, are the challenges. It doesn't sound very sexy. It doesn't sound like, and the trouble is, of all the climate change aspects, I think sea level rise is the least understood, the least accepted, and yet perhaps the starkest. It just is happening so slowly, you can't make a movie about it. And the public really responds to movies. You know, Asteroids from Space makes a great movie. A few centimeters a year, it doesn't make a really good movie. So I shouldn't laugh. It's so sad and dire that it is sad. All right, I'm not sure how I can get my, let's see, share screen. I'll try to do that. Desktop. This is a book I wrote some time ago, and it was just a book. You know, books happen and then they go away. The Flooded Earth: Future in a World Without Ice Caps. It's funny too, because editors just don't get it. I wrote the subtitle as Our Future in a World Without Ice Sheets, because ice sheets and their loss, as John really knows too, is it's way worse than losing the ice caps. We can melt all the ice in the floating in the ocean that you want. It's not going to affect sea level at all, but every molecule that falls in from the ice sheet causes sea level to rise. And I gave this talk, strangely enough, to me at least, I was asked to be an honorary member of Seattle's ritziest club. My father was a businessman in Seattle. I was born and raised here, and just sheer dumb chance academically, you don't get to pick where you want to live, but I got to come back to my home city. And I was outraged to find out that we built this gigantic tunnel and it's been engineered for a foot of sea level rise. And they said that's all we can expect in the next 100 years, 1 foot. Well, come on now. We're seeing with storm surge things that are much worse than that. And unfortunately, the city of Seattle, so progressive supposedly, is still run by engineers who refuse to accept really what's going on. The other thing that has spooked me is, again, in my city, is that we have so many port facilities that have not been engineered for the rise in sea level. When you have ships, we do have tides and mesotidal ups and downs, but nevertheless, those cranes and all the things about ships that are going to be riding higher at the high tide line, we've got to engineer for that too. And even CNN some years ago came out with some estimates of what it would cost for just to change the port facilities, just the ports around the world. And it was astronomical. I mean, they were talking trillions of dollars. But then add in replacing every airport that is now at sea level. You know, you fly into San Francisco or Sydney or Hawaii or China or Japan, and it just goes on and on and on. And every one of those is going to be affected by the rising sea level. Seattle just tried to build a new runway. One runway was $1 billion. So what if you have to replace the entire airport? So the net aspect of all this is how much of gross national product of any country will have to be dedicated to dealing with sea level rise. Well, the Netherlands already knows this. And actually, I'm not good with figures. It's compared to anywhere else, they are paying the largest percentage of their gross national product trying to deal with the fact that they are being inundated more quickly and certainly more dangerously than almost any other country. But it's going to have to be everybody that has a coastline because the ocean is all connected, as we know. So anyway, I'm going to just go through this pretty quickly. And John, you chime in, because John Englander, who is also here, I think has much more on the ball about this than I do. And I'm really glad you're here, John.
You're being too kind.
You get to the talking points. And unfortunately, this again happened last night. I was talking to an AM radio nationwide United States audience last night, and probably 60 or 70% Trump voters, and they just don't want to hear this stuff. And the people that call in, they just keep telling you global warming is natural, so anything that's natural can't hurt you. And even if it were happening, the evidence is unclear that American industries can be harmed by this, that global warming is beneficial, and we can adapt to climate change, that none of this is a problem. What's absolutely breaking my heart is just looking at the Biden presidency. The Biden presidency started with, we are really going to attack climate change issues, and those have fallen by the wayside. I mean, what you hear now is border security. Why are we having the need for border security? This is only going to increase. And in the book I started this with, I finally just went way over the top, started some scenarios of several hundred years from now of what happens when entire countries, Bangladesh, is now 50% covered. Where are they going to go? Well, they're going to run into India, and they're going to run into any place that has higher ground. Now, how are you going to stop these people? Sinking ships, people try to get off. They get in lifeboats when they can, and the lifeboat is going to be the high land next to them. So I've got an astrobiological bent, and I have a great partner who keeps me going, Don Brownlee. We wrote the book you mentioned, Rare Earth, some years ago. And interestingly enough to me, we're now writing a sequel to it in a way. The book, it was a lot easier for me to write books in the past than it is now, whatever. Old brains don't work quite as well. It's just you can't get as many hours. But this is one of Don's slides, which I love. And he starts out his talk saying, which of these planets is Earth-like? And the answer is all of them. I mean, this is the Earth through a 12 billion year history. We started out in the far upper left, an ocean planet with very little land area at all. We're going to end up an oceanless planet in the far lower right before the sun 7 billion years from now expands to the point where it goes beyond the orbit of Mars, enveloping the Earth and incinerating it one final time. But the oceans began long before that. So Earth-like planets, they keep talking about Earth-like planets, and it cracks me up. We found another Earth-like planet. It's only twice the mass of Earth, but that's really Earth-like, right? No, it's not. Earth-like is not only size, but it's time. When are you looking at the particular planet? And we are looking at a time now when we're going through such rapid change in our atmosphere. We're seeing faster warming now than any time in geological history. This was a headline last night, and I tend to agree with it. Even the huge runaway greenhouse that happened at the end of the Permian with the Siberian traps putting out as much CO2 as any time in the past that we can see, it's nothing like what's happened in the last 100 years. I mean, this is a unique time in Earth history. So we are having runaway greenhouse and extremely rapid temperature rise. I've been trying to do this with stable isotopes. And again, I talked to John. I've just come back from Papua New Guinea. I first went there in 1984, and I'm going back to the same places. Well, the first thing is all the people I worked with in Papua New Guinea who were around in 1984 are dead now. I mean, the time of life of a Papua New Guinea citizen turns out to be not as long as us, especially when you chew betel nut and it rots your teeth away. And no teeth leads to tooth decay, which leads to heart attacks, which leads to almost nobody with gray hair there. But in that time, from 1984 till this last trip, 2024, so here's a nice 40 years of two bookends of looking down there, of trying to understand those faunas. What's striking to me now of studying the four reef slopes, my interest starts at 100 meters and ends at 700 meters. Now that's where the chambered nautilus lives, but that's where most of the fish have been fished out. I mean, the beautiful cold water snappers, Aeolus, the Chinese have been running through all the Pacific Islands. They pretty much own the Pacific Islands, and their fishing concerns have just cleaned out. Deepwater fish grow very slowly. They reproduce in very small numbers. They're very easy to catch. Any bit of meat down there is, oh, hey, I better go get that. And they can find it for long distances. But what we are finding is the bottom is being inundated by cephalopods. When this is a sort of a paleontologist, it's like a treat, right? This is like the basal Jurassic, go to Lyme Regis. Then the Triassic extinction takes out almost everything. And you walk along the beach in Lyme Regis, and all of a sudden there's cephalopod shells everywhere, ammonites. You find the same thing after the Cretaceous extinction. You find the same thing after the Permian. Well, we're in a case now where the fish are dead, cephalopods are taken back over. There was a beautiful study in 2014 out of University of Adelaide showing it's not just my nautiluses, but squid and cuttlefish, the cephalopods are really making a big comeback. But sea level change is also something that I was concerned with, and certainly the people where I was working with in Caviang and Manus Island are the areas where I've been working. New Britain, New Ireland, these are not high islands. These are limestone-rich, low islands. And the people, the scientists that are there are very concerned. How do we protect this? And the reefs themselves, how do we try to keep a viable living habitat for the humans here? So the fact that sea level rises and falls, this is a picture I took last June. I was invited and went with two friends, two paleontologists, to drive from Seattle to Kansas. And that was as much a sociological interesting trip to go from liberal Seattle to Kansas. We started out, we were paying $5.50 a gallon for gasoline. And by the time we got to Kansas, it was $2.10 a gallon for gasoline. But we didn't see a single one of those Teslas anywhere. I mean, the Teslas stop at the Washington border. But this is an ancient sea. This is in late Cretaceous chalk in western Kansas, Badlands, this beautiful country. There's a gigantic ocean going right through the middle. You try to tell people in these talks that sea level can and does rise, and just look at North America. In this particular case, this would be 75 million years ago. There is major changes. The world does change. The Earth-like planet becomes very un-Earth-like in many ways. Oceans of Kansas had a whole bunch of creatures so different than those we have now. And so we were out there digging this stuff up. And I thought, looking at this stuff and just getting a sense, it'd be very nice to get people who deny that the earth changes to come out and walk some of these beds. Strange creatures, pre-KT extinction, big clams called inoceramids. This was a completely different world. And that's what mass extinctions do, is they not only reset evolutionarily what is there, but they really control and dictate what happens next. So this is a Cretaceous world, and these great big dinner plate clams were everywhere back then, and they're nowhere now. These things disappeared and were never replaced. Pterosaur wing, great big beautiful creatures out here. So sea level changes from this figure, they certainly have been up and down and up and down. This is nothing like a static Earth. We've had great changes in what's been going on. People want to know, why does sea level go up and down? And I think all of us know that when glaciers melt and continental ice sheets melt, we certainly cause sea level to rise. But there's as much or more aspect of sea level rise coming from tectonics. I mean, think about the oceans that are underlaid by these gigantic spreading centers, such as we have the mid-ocean ridge through the Atlantic. If you have an increase of heat hitting a mid-ocean ridge, it swells. Rocks are like anything else. You heat them, they expand. Heat an entire 1,000-mile lineament where basalt is bubbling out right down the middle of the Atlantic, causing the island of Iceland to be formed and continue. That heat causes that mid-ocean ridge to rise up, but over time, the amount of heat hitting the mid-ocean ridges can rise and fall. And when you have even slightly less heat, but now multiplied over thousands of miles, it cools. Cool rock subsides, and sea level has changed. The ocean basins are a bathtub. So there's a lot of tectonic influence on what's going on. And we're seeing along North America right now, we're seeing a lot of subsidence of the East Coast. So you've got lots of different factors going on within the sea level changes themselves. So a longer picture, we can see cycles, first order cycles, super cycles, and we geologists love looking at these figures. They really can explain an awful lot about when we have oceans and when we don't. But these are the long-term ancient cycles, and that's not really what we're worrying about now. We're not worrying about mid-ocean ridges expanding or subsiding, because these are hundreds of thousand to million-year events. What really, if you really want to change sea level, get yourself in a good glacial period and make those glaciers, continental glaciers, expand and retreat. And then you're really talking. So there's lots of ways that sea level can change. Here's just a quick couple of figures, the position of the continents. Certainly when we have great big faults taking place, certainly when we have continental ice caps and we can increase or decrease these volumes, that itself is also going to affect sea level change. And here's this idea where oceanic crust can cool and contract, or when there's more heat coming up tectonically, it becomes more buoyant, it rises up. And the bathtub, if you raise the center of a bathtub, it's going to go over the edges, which it does onto the continents. And so the really large scale ups and downs of the last several billion years have been related to this, global tectonics. So we've got really big pulses of CO2 in the past, and I think the CO2 curves are really important to understand. The times of the big mass extinctions, the Permo-Triassic, the Triassic-Jurassic, Cretaceous Tertiary, each of these was a time of major flood basalts, enormous quantities of lava that are being exposed and exuded out of these long cracks. It's like the mid-ocean ridges, but on continents, or times when even the mid-ocean ridges really radically increase the amount of heat rising up. So why did these things happen? They're very interesting effects. Huge hunks of the crust of the Earth are broken apart. What causes the breaking is that pieces of the core of the planet, hot, mobile, gigantic quantities of rock, are detached from the top of the core. They rise through the mantle, and they finally hit the surface as a continental flood basalt, and you have enormous quantities spreading out over land surfaces. It takes 20 to 25 million years for these things to rise from their detachment up to the surface before they become exposed. The last big one was the Columbia River basalt, but that really wasn't big compared to these things. These three here, enormous, and each of them had an extinction along with it. So we can really look at sea level in the past, sea level in the future, if we have a good sense of how much, what the global temperature is, how much ice volume is present. The Eocene of 40 million years ago was a time of no ice at all. The Antarctic ice sheets really started getting put in place probably in the Miocene. The Miocene started 20 million years ago, ended 5 million years ago. So it's really a fairly recent thing if you think about the long-term age of the Earth, where we do have these enormous quantities of ice on the surface. So Antarctica itself, as you've been seeing in the news, is that this and Greenland are the two major determinants of what's going to happen in the future. I mean, you've got lots of ocean glaciers, of mountain glaciers here and there melting, but those are really minor players in all this. It really does boil down to the really large Antarctic ice sheets, to a lesser extent, Greenland. But the Antarctic ice is, I think, what we are most critically looking at and worried about. And it's not just what the ice does in melting, it's the fact that the melting itself affects the big escalator-like conveyor belt circulation patterns that themselves are affecting the ocean, oxygen on the bottom of the ocean. And I think you saw in the press in the last couple of months that the very critical downdrop of cold oxygenated seawater in the North Atlantic by Greenland seems to be either slowing down or stopping. And if that happens over the next century, we're going to have all hell's going to break loose in Europe, which is going to get very, very cold, very, very fast. This is from Eric Steig. He's in my department. I spent 35 days with him on the Antarctic Peninsula up in the upper part of the screen in, I guess it was 2009. We got dropped off by a United States research vessel 35 days later, picked us back up. Luckily, we had enough food that lasted that long. But his major work is ice cores, and he's been ice coring Antarctica for a very long time. And this is one of his graphs. And there's been this long sense that Antarctica is alone among the continents is not warming. Well, it is. And this is one of his graphs showing what has been happening now over the last several centuries, and especially the last 50 years in Antarctica, which the orange is where significant warming is taking place. And so this is, again, why these big ice sheets, and especially the Western Antarctic ice sheet, the one that is most critical, are worrying people quite a bit. The amount of ice that's present within the North Atlantic, this has been in the press quite a bit, that we're heading toward what appears to be ice-free all year round pretty soon, on the old dream of a Northwest Passage that all these explorers live for, search for, and dive for, I think is going to be realized here, certainly perhaps not the lifetimes of anybody on this particular telecast, but in our kids' lifetimes, it should finally become ice-free. And we can see from the graph in the lower left, the sea ice and how quickly over the years it's been disappearing. Here on the left is a picture, at least, of the thickness of the Greenland ice sheets, and Greenland itself also a player. If all of it disappears, if we have Greenland plus the Western Antarctic ice sheet disappearing, the estimate is sea level goes up 14 meters. Look, sea level going up 2 meters would already be a gigantic human extermination event. 14 meters is unthinkable. Well, it is thinkable. Different world. So we know ice keeps retreating, but when an ice sheet retreats, you get pictures like that. It seems like, well, there's no consequence. We just no longer have ice there. But all that ice, it didn't evaporate into thin air. It headed to the ocean. So when you have these retreats, what you're talking about is an increase in sea level. Here's the old hockey stick. I was happy as hell to hear that Michael Mann actually won the lawsuit. He was just awarded $1 million because there were a number of really scurrilous I guess, pseudo journalist saying that he had faked the data, and it went to court. And just a month ago, whenever I think something happened recently, it was longer ago than that. That's my senility. But he won this court case because this is quite real. And this is the very famous, now 25 years old, sense that we were in a very constant level of global temperature till we hit the Industrial Revolution. And so that long stick of the hockey stick, well, the tip of it that goes up, 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 that has to be human caused. And so more graphs of these things, ocean heat content, that if we stop putting CO2 into the atmosphere even now, we're still going to have a meter rise of sea level. There's that much heat baked into the oceans. Thermal expansion is going to happen, and we're going to have to pay that price. But what also scares me, I'll show you a few graphs coming up, is that all the graphs pretty much stop about 2100. And they're not going to stop. The sea level rise is not going to stop. It's an asymptotic rise. We're looking at a curve that is not like a hockey stick stops at 2100. The tip of that hockey stick gets closer and closer to vertical. So then we start getting really runaway temperature rises. So there's lots of graphs out there. I can't keep up with them, but these are the many estimates that the various international bodies have tried to come up with. There's the best news scenarios, the worst news scenarios. But what you don't see is any single graph that says sea level rise is not going to happen. It's just what is the degree to which it will happen is all we have. And what controls this, of course, is going to be the absolute temperature rise. How high will it go? And when will that happen? So at least in this upper graph, we're seeing 2350 with levels of CO2. And what sort of temperature rise can you expect to have in temperatures going on when you have various levels of CO2 for the next century or so being pumped into the atmosphere? So if we get up to 1,000 ppm, that's what we had in the Eocene. That's an ice-free world. So we get to 1,000 parts per million, and we're back to the Eocene. The great David Battisti was the person who first scared the pants off me. He gave a talk in the late 1990s saying 1,000 ppm was the title of his talk, and beneath it, back to the Eocene, because that is Eocene. And they showed lots of pictures of what the Eocene world looked like. It doesn't look anything like this world, and there was no ice at all. We have pretty good Eocene rocks in Washington State. We have the most beautiful fossil palm trees you can imagine. The marine invertebrates are cowries and cone shells and all the beautiful tropical stuff that one finds in the tropics today. And that's at latitude 48 degrees. So it was a global tropical world with no ice and sea level at least 100 meters higher than it is today. So that is what 1,000 ppm gets you. So the graphs, I'm not going to labor this. I mean, I can send you guys this PowerPoint if you want. I haven't been updating it the last year or two. This book of mine got redone by the Germans this past year. They translated it. I had to redo a bunch of it. But my publisher took all that money. I got a beautiful $3,000 check from the Germans. And then the US publisher said, send it to us. We have the rights. So there's that. But that's at least the Germans got to see it. So what's our future? I mean, what do we have? And that's what we have, or just there's no certainty other than it's going to go up. And so looking at what happens to the hockey stick over time is extremely important. And I think trying to, it's not as if you can put an argument out, it's that the argument has to be repeated over and over and over and over. That those of us who see this and understand the scariness of it somehow have to keep saying and try to keep getting the word out. And it's like crying wolf, except there really is a wolf. You know, wolf, 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 wolf. Well, there's lots of them. And people don't want to hear wolf anymore. They get tired of it. John, you know this. You give these talks, and after a while, they don't hear you anymore. Yeah, okay, yeah, right. Well, I'm much more worried about inflation, or gee, I better think about this. And those of us who see this have to keep trying to at least get people to listen. Mm-hmm. The various estimates, again, I can show these graphs ad nauseum, but they all tell the same story. It's going up. So I wanted to finish, if I could. Again, I talked 2 hours last night. I'm a little hoarse. I'm still teaching because I'm not brave enough to retire. The countries that are probably most impacted, Bangladesh. Bangladesh right now, as I understand it, feeds itself wonderfully. I mean, they have 3 rice crops a year. And if you can have 3 complete harvests in any given year, that's a lot of food. But this is the map where sea level rise of even a meter starts affecting the rice crops. And again, to me, the greatest danger is still going to be part 1, the famine, when rice goes, because most rice is at sea level. And this is the problem with sea level rise is everybody thinks about the vertical distance, but it's the horizontal distance. The fact that seawater leaches sideways, salinization affects soil, and you don't even have to have the sea covering that soil, not even once, for it to become ruined. We're seeing this in the San Joaquin Valley in California now. The levees and the system that they're trying to have in place, if you go through Sacramento, you go over these big freeways that are raised up. So the San Joaquin Valley is worrying about salt intrusion, and Bangladesh is really worried about salt intrusion. This is a country that has a lot of people, and it's a country where 1 meter sea level rise is going to vastly affect their ability to feed each other. Another look at some of this particular area, the various estimates with India, and trying to understand how you could put in this low-lying stuff in India and where are these people going to go? Well, Bangladesh people are going to head for high ground, and so they're going to have to cross borders. So let's finish up with some favorite places. Here's San Francisco with some of the sea level estimates, and the pale blue in there is an estimate of what is going to happen in the Bay Area. And talking about Sacramento, the north part of this particular picture leads to the Sacramento Delta, and the San Joaquin Valley is one of the most important food production areas in all of America. I mean, the amount of food that grows and how quickly it grows in that system is really phenomenal. But the Bay Area itself is such a very crowded place. And when we're looking at these pale blue areas that will themselves, if not covered by the sea, at least through storm surge, be affected to the point that it will affect transportation, it will affect infrastructure, certainly roads will be damaged. And right in the middle of all that is, of course, the San Francisco airport here. And this is, I think, an estimate of one meter sea level rise. So by 2100, this can be lost, will be lost. And how much will it cost to move this? And where will you move it? And how will you move it? You need an airport in San Francisco. If it just goes uphill a little bit, that's fine for another century or a half century, and then it has to get moved again. I mean, at what point do you stop moving your airports and say, well, maybe we should put it up on that 100-foot tall hill there? How much does that cost? What is the cost to a government, even as one as rich as America and California, to move an entire airport? Huge. And these are the problems we do not see discussed enough. So one of the ideas is put a dam across where the Golden Gate is. Let's dam it up. And as stupid as this sounds, in fact, back in the 1930s, there was a beautiful plan to dam the Mediterranean away, to go right across from Gibraltar down to Morocco and build this giant wall, and that the entire Mediterranean civilization would be dammed in. They didn't know about sea level rise then, but this, I forget the person who suggested this, some of the pictures are just fantastic. But maybe it's not so far-fetched anymore. The cost of trying to save all of these fantastic civilizations in Italy and France and all the coastal regions of Europe, what is the cost of trying to move them uphill for a while till you have to do it again, as compared to building these giant geoengineering things? To me, it still makes way more sense to dam off these great big estuaries than the even crazier and scarier geoengineering that I hear about, putting big platforms in space or to salt the atmosphere with aerosols to produce a global cooling. Now we're really talking about extinction level events. First of all, you have to put up giant space mirrors, and not one of them can ever crash on takeoff. I don't know. And simply dropping sulfur aerosols into the atmosphere, every lake underneath it is going to become so acidic that nothing will grow in it. How are your crops going to grow when this stuff falls out of the atmosphere? So the geoengineering, the major big ones, are even scarier than these still mega projects of construction, to me at least. I started thinking about what 1 meter does to the American coast. And one of the things I mentioned earlier about what is put on coastlines is transportation. But the other thing that's put on coastlines are toxic waste dumps. And there's no coastline with more toxic waste dumps than the coast of Texas and especially Louisiana, because that is where the oil refineries are. And so all of the really badass chemicals that are being produced in such enormous quantities are put in these huge repositories that are themselves usually right at sea level, because you can bring boats in and dump it off. Boy, that's going to be scary. Do we even know where all these things are anymore? So if you look at 1 meter in Florida, the Everglades is gone. I mean, the Everglades is just gone. You're going to have salinization of the Everglades, and all the freshwater drinking plants that are in there are going to die off. This is a pretty interesting hit to the photosynthetic potential of Florida. You've got a whole lot of plants that are not going to be pumping out oxygen anymore, but you're certainly going to have a whole lot more people that are going to have to move, and infrastructure that's going to have to be moved as well. Florida, one more time. This is, again, I've lived down in South Florida, and they're already very low lying. I think that the highest elevation of Florida is only 20 feet above sea level at the moment. And even that, of course, years down the road.
Not quite that bad, actually, Peter. It's Orlando's 80 feet above sea level. The maximum.
Okay, I stand, and thank you. I stand corrected. I know it's low, so we can put everybody in Florida on the 80-foot hill, and it'll all be happily ever after. Okay, China, it turns out for reasons that I don't understand, but sea level rise seems to be faster along the Chinese coast than in many other places. And so China itself is facing challenges, again, rice production and infrastructure along the various boundaries along the South China Sea. So we've got lots of these estimates of sea level rise. I didn't really want to go into those other than give them. And here is finally the last graph, and should be the last graph, the various types of fixes that people have suggested. And so the fixes are changing, covering huge amounts of the desert with tinfoil or white. Painting every roof in Australia is actually a pretty effective way to do it. Urban surface albedo, this is way down in the lower left. And this graph it's not my graph, but this is something I stole. Effectiveness on the left and affordability on the right. So you want to be as far to the left as you can, as low as you can. But up in the far right corner, of course, the stratospheric aerosol, where we get as many jets as we can, just pumping out all kinds of sulfur compounds in the atmosphere. Very, very, very expensive. And everything in between.
No, you're wrong. That's affordability over there.
Affordability. Okay, well, affordability.
It's more affordable to the right.
Low effectiveness, high affordability. All right, well, maybe we should do it. I am wrong. I'll take it back. Don't do it in any effect. We've got, again, accelerated warming that seems to be happening, but I think that's enough for me. I don't think I had another slide here, but I want to finish up and open the floor and just, I guess Chicken Little yelling, screaming is something that's easy to do, I suppose. I get tired of doing it, but I think it needs to be done. So with that, I'm going to end, and thank you for your attention.
Well, thank you, Peter. Oh, Robert, you're going to recognize the hands, Mike McCracken, and
yes, I'll moderate the discussion, and I'll just ask Peter to. I'll just stop the share, and we'll just go back to this format. Thanks so much, Peter. That was just extraordinary, and really appreciate that overview of the problem. I do want to just open up the questions, and I ask everyone if they wish to speak, please do use the raise hand function, and I'll come to you in order of as you raise your hand. So the first thing, I was just quite surprised about your final comments about solar geoengineering, and the sense that I have is that the safety issues are not so severe as you described, and also in particular that marine cloud brightening offers the potential to significantly slow the speed of sea level rise, also to slow the speed of problems like polar drift and systemic disruptions. And so I think that that's going to be a really important debate in the climate space, just the idea that albedo is a more tractable lever than carbon to address the problems of climate change. I'd be interested in your thoughts on that.
I'm not an engineer, but I'm sitting here going to learn too. So I have the least confidence in any of this in my expertise saying anything about engineering. I'm an earth science specialist, and so I'll stand corrected.
Okay, let's just move on to Mike.
Thank you. That was interesting history and things. One correction, and it's about sort of the geoengineering thing. So with respect to sulfur injection in the stratosphere, there's already several tens of millions of tons of SO2 emitted at the surface of the troposphere. The amount that would be put into the stratosphere is a small fraction of that and would be spread over the globe. So you're not going to basically acidify everywhere. But the question I want to raise is I've been feeling as well for a few decades in my reviews of IPCC, trying to get them to pay more attention to sea level rise. And that ought to be a metric that is used much more. And the response I get is basically to the effect that a whole bunch of other things are going to get you first, so don't worry about sea level rise. Namely that for example, temperature, or if you actually think about it, heat index, will be creating many more environmental refugees first rather than sea level rise. There's also people who would argue that a food crisis in the world is going to cause much more problem first before sea level rise. And then there are health people who might say a pandemic might do it or something else. And I guess the question does come back to what you were saying at the start is how do you get people to really pay attention to sea level rise as a key issue, if not, at least for us, certainly for future generations?
I don't know. I mean, John and I have both written books about this. And
yeah, John, I'd be interested in your thoughts too. Yeah.
John, I'm tired. Go ahead, John, fire away.
Okay, thanks. There's no right answer to this, but from my 20 years of trying to wake up people about sea level, I think we have to be more aggressive and more assertive. Actually, I even though I have the highest respect for Peter, I've learned so much from him over the years, but I actually think he's underplaying, how bad this will be. Because of the extra heat we put in the ocean, we've warmed the sea surface temperature over 1 degree now. Even if we cut out all fossil fuels today, the truth is enough heat in the ocean that we're going to probably get 20 meters of sea level rise. It's just a matter of how many centuries it takes. So while we don't want to be alarmist and we don't want to exaggerate, and it's hard to find the science to back up how much ice will melt this century, but the signs are growing that we're facing catastrophe. I mean, the temperatures in Antarctic and particularly Greenland are just get worse every year, and literally. And if people ask me, I'm in my more recent book that I wrote 2 years ago, I say, I think we're looking at 5 to 10 feet of sea level rise, to keep it simple, whether it's 2 or 3 meters. I can't be more specific than that. I can't prove that, but when you go to Greenland, as I do often, and and when you see the news, the headlines coming out of Antarctica, I think we really do need to start thinking of 5 or 10 feet. And if we use those figures as guesstimates, educated guesses, and looked at, a couple of feet by mid-century, the threat, the more imminent threat than saying a foot or two this century, and worse will be next century. Because the longer it is in the future and the more vague it is, the less incentive there is to do anything.
Yes.
And so,
Yeah, I have tended to start out my talks sometimes by saying that if you go back 20,000 years, which is 200 centuries, sea level was down by 120 meters. That was what it was at the peak of the last glacial. And for the next 12,000 years coming out of that, on average, sea level rose a meter per century as global average temperature was going up maybe 1 degree C every 20 centuries, every 2,000 years or something like that. And here we've gone up a degree in the last century, and we're going to go up another 2 this century almost, pretty much.
yeah, when you mix those
And you
things
look
together,
and you look at that, and that basically says that the equilibrium sea level sensitivity is 15 to 20 meters per degree C warming.
Right.
I mean, it's huge. And yeah, it's just amazing we can't get more attention to that.
Okay, let's go on. Unless John, you're welcome to respond to that, but we can move on to the next
No, totally.
questions.
The only other point that I would make is that, again, I think Peter's insight into the agricultural impacts is spot on. But again, to make it of relevance to more people, thinking about 5 or 10 feet of sea level rise, 2 or 3 meters, has such devastating coastal effects in 140 nations, in places people don't think about, like Denmark and Vietnam, of course. I mean, all over the world. And it's not just going to be agriculture, although that will be prime, but it's even going to be finance, if you think. I mean, I hate to make it really commercial, but that's what people respond to, because the whole financial markets are based upon, real estate security, and much of it is coastal. And when it becomes clear that that is not the super secure investment that everybody thinks it is, coastal real estate, that gets people to think twice. So we all have to, experiment with different arguments and explanations, but it's not just the agriculture. It's we're going to be forced out of tens of thousands of coastal communities, from large cities like London to small townships, in Asia.
Thank you, John. I just wanted to once again plug Peter's great book, Under a Green Sky. And
Terrific book.
The thing that I found most interesting in it was how CO2 causes ocean stratification and the risk of hydrogen sulfide coming out of that. So anyway, we'll just continue on. And I notice Mark has put a question in the chat, and I'll come back to Mark's question in turn. So Robert Chris, please.
I'm muted. Right. Hi. Yes, what a fantastic talk. So I think that John has just answered my first question, which was, if I understood you correctly, this sea level rise is now baked in as far as any kind of intervention in the carbon cycle is concerned. I think what you just said was that even if we got to, even if we just cut emissions out tomorrow, that sea level rise is still baked in. So if that's the case, is there any other intervention that we could make? Forget for the moment about feasibility, okay? But just in principle, from an earth science perspective, is there any kind of intervention that could be done at sufficient scale and speed to avert the kind of sea level rise that you two guys are talking about? And the second question is, if the answer to that is yes, we could do X, Y, Z, then how feasible is that?
Peter?
I don't know. I'm not an engineer. I'm going to pass it back to you.
Well, what about the earth,
okay.
what about the earth
We have
science
some-
point?
we have some great engineers on the call, Mike McCracken and others. So, but let me just say the way I explain this simply, okay, is there is this correlation of global temperature or global sea level to global average temperature. And it's about 20 meters per degree Celsius, as Mike just said. Even if we cut off all emissions today, I mean, like literally just stopped everything, the heat that's in the ocean, we've put the pot of water on the stove and turned up the heat and put a block of ice in it. When you turn off the heat, the ice doesn't stop melting because there's this heat stored in the liquid, right, in the ocean. And we're going to melt ice for centuries, and even if we cut off the warming. So there's the imbalance at this point, and you've got to get back to equilibrium.
John, just let me pick this up then. So if we were to do some kind of direct cooling, whether it's stratospheric aerosols, whether it's marine cloud brightening, or whether it is putting mirrors in the Lagrange 1 point in this, whatever it is, if we were to do some serious planetary cooling, could that stop it?
I defer to Mike McCracken probably rather than answering the question that way, but I don't know if Mike's got an. Put him on the spot.
I think you can slow it down. I think it's really hard to stop it. I think at one time, Tom Wigley did a calculation of trying to stop sea level rise and published it in Science, if I recall, maybe 25 years ago. And his view was to stop it, you had to go back to 280 parts per million, or maybe even a little less.
Right.
To really get it cold enough. And so you really would have to get it pretty cold, and getting that cold would have a lot of impacts on society as well. I mean, they talk about termination shock going up. There'd be if you try and go back suddenly, when you talk about this climate intervention issues, a lot of people talk about it, oh, I'll wait till I get some point and then I'll do a big change down. That would have horrendous effects. I mean, you really want to start now if you're going to do it and try and shave off peak warming and keep the temperature down, but that isn't quite where we're headed right now.
Well, along those lines of what Mike's talking about in terms of slowing it down, we know the planet was brighter 20 years ago, and so marine cloud rebrightening in the boundary layer, the bottom 1,000 meters, demonstrably, we know from the negative experiment of the IMO, had a profound effect on North Atlantic temperatures. So, 60%, John can correct me, but 60% of sea level rise is probably the heat that's going into the ocean. As soon as we actually reflect, restore the brightness of the planet and locally and regionally, but ultimately in high latitude regions where it matters, and reflect those more sunlight with the marine clouds back the way it was pre-industrially, I think there's a great opportunity to actually manage our temperatures while we're getting our carbon budgets back in balance. And so slowing it down, I think there's definitely something we can do. And probably one of the most innocuous approaches is rebrightening marine clouds to their pre-industrial levels.
Thank you, Brian. So I'll just check if John or Peter have any comments at this point.
I'm learning, so I'm happy to listen.
While we're doing that, I did have one other comment, and that is really want to thank John and Peter for this presentation and information. What struck me about what Peter said is that we're concave up on sea level for the next century, right? So we should be plotting the 500-year curve, because concave up just means, accelerating sea level rise. And I think we need to really talk about that, not just 2100, but the next 4 centuries or 5 centuries. And we know that the Earth system is capable of 10 feet of sea level rise on century timescales based on the Merida coral reefs. And that was at a ppm of 280, 120,000 years ago. So what can we do at a doubling? Because, if you add in methane and you add in nitrous oxide, we're just about at a doubling now. And so we're twice as high as that 280. And so it's completely logical. The Earth system is capable of more than 10 feet of sea level rise on century timescales.
Wait, say that last sentence, Brian. What was it?
The Earth is fully capable of more than 10 feet of sea level rise on century timescales, given that the forcing function is twice as strong as it was 120,000 years ago. And we had 10 feet of sea level rise from the standing coral reefs back then. And so, what is it, 10 to 20 feet? It's really the sky's the limit on that, unfortunately.
That's it. Without the human forcing, without the heat we've added, just by nature, as you said, between 14 and 11,000 years ago, sea level was rising 65 feet over 4 centuries. That's a foot a decade for 4 centuries, in a row. So we know the system is capable of that kind of meltdown of Antarctica and Greenland. And we know that sea level naturally can rise more than a foot a decade for 40 decades on end. I mean, that's amazing, right? And then when you put in the heat we've got in the system, the truth is we're kidding ourselves if we think we can stop sea level from rising at the current level. We have to do all the things everybody's suggesting, all of them. And we have to start designing for a world when sea level is 10 or 20 feet higher, as it last was 122,000 years ago when it got 75 feet higher. Or sorry, about that.
But it will still be rising then, though.
Yes.
And as you say, John, we're on the sharp end of the sawtooth. The last million years has had sawtooths of ice ages, but the deglaciations are amazingly sharp and discontinuous. And then it takes a long time for life to get us back to an ice age again. So it's very fast and nonlinear.
Let's move on to Bruce Melton.
Hello, everyone. Comment and a question. I'm not seeing any sea level rise projections with climate restoration modeled or speculated even. If we cool the oceans, they're going to contract. That's a loss of sea level. The rate, the amount, that's all speculation and modeling. But fundamentally, if we restore our climate, we're going to cool the oceans, and the oceans are going to contract, and we're going to lose some of the sea level rise that we've gained. As far as the continued collapse of our ice sheets, Feldman and Leverman 2016 say that if we cool the upper and upper mid oceans, which is responsible for most of the ice sheet collapse, that they will stabilize, but we've got to do it before about mid-century, which is the point of no return. If we miss the point of no return, the collapse does become irreversible. How do we get people's attention? I film it. The Global Warming Society, Global Warming Psychology, it says that almost the most important thing we can do to increase awareness is to show people, is personal impacts. Showing people is a personal impact. I go down to South Padre Island, and film sea level rise during king tides. We're having beach erosion events beyond king tides these days, by the way. But I go down there and I put myself in peril, or at least that's what my mechanics tell me, by driving through the surf, because there's no beach left. You got to drive through the surf, get salt water all over you, and to film and to show people. And global warming psychology says that one of the single most important things to increase awareness is personal impacts. Showing people is a personal impact. And a question for everybody. And John Engler, good to see you. Peter, thank you for everything you've done for the environment over the years. The question is about Nichols 2011 in AR4, Assessment Report 4. The IPCC quotes Nichols as saying that anything above 3 feet of sea level rise per century and adaptation scenarios are limited, which, y'all have talked about that here. I think that's one of the most important things with the impacts that sea level rise, any climate change impact is going to have, is going to be an economic thing. If we break our global economic engine, we're toast. What do you guys, Peter, John, Mike, anybody, have to say about Nichols 3 feet, IPCC saying that adaptation strategies are limited beyond 3 feet per century?
I'm going to defer to better experts.
That's an opinion. I wouldn't disagree with it. I would probably say it even more strongly, but
I think we don't have till 2050. The last I saw, there's the major ice shelves in Antarctica are unzipping like a kilometer per year. They've got 20 kilometers to where the seawater starts flooding underneath the ice shelf. And the result is you're going to have an irreversible thing. So that's 2044 optimistically. I think, these tipping points are there. To quote Sir David King, we've passed multiple tipping points, and what we do in the next 3 or 4 years will determine the fate of civilization for the next thousands of years. So I think we are at an inflection point.
Yeah, Bruce, were you saying that that the first 3 feet will do it, or were you saying you could have 3 feet, 3 feet, 3 feet per century and keep doing it? Because once you get the first 3 feet, it's going to be horrendous for virtually all the coastlines. I mean, I don't think you get to then say you're going to do it again. If we're rising 3 feet per century, that's just a humongous effect. You have to relocate everything.
What I get from reading Nichols is that there's enough money to relocate everything with just 3 feet per century. So yes, 3 feet per century, per century, per century. There's enough money to do that. It won't break the bank.
I don't buy that.
I don't buy that either. I think that's complete bullshit. This whole idea that we can have enough money in this world to still have all the wars we're having, which are very expensive, and fix sea level rise. We've got to get rid of one or the other, and it's not at this stage.
Yeah, is there enough? I mean, is there enough fertile land? Yeah, is there enough fertile land to put, after you flood the Central Valley and you flood the Southeast Asia and you flood a whole bunch? I mean, is there enough agricultural land to even grow food to do that? I mean, I get worried about these economists. I mean, Nordhaus's model was once run for a 10-degree C warming, global warming, and it said it was like a 30% effect on GDP. And you go, you got to be crazy. I mean, maybe that's true, but you're going to be spending 100% of your GDP on relocating, and trying to recover our air conditioning building. I mean, it was just, some of these economic analyses, I think, have been silly. I want to go back to one point you said, Bruce, about thermal expansion. Thermal expansion isn't really the big issue. I mean, Susan Solomon, when she ran the third assessment, IPCC assessment, they were then talking about 1 meter out in 2100s or something like that. And that was in part because there was this notion that for East Antarctica, the water would become warmer and you'd be piling up more snow on it, and that would help pull sea level down a little bit. But thermal expansion is actually not that big a term. It gets up to maybe 1 meter total. Most of it's going to be from thawing ice. Right now, all the heat in the oceans only caused some fraction of the sea level rise we've had to present, and that's only, I don't know, what, 20 centimeters maybe or something of the sea level rise. So cooling the ocean isn't, I mean, you need to cool the ocean to cool the climate, but I'm not sure the thermal expansion is the big term. It's the ice on land that's the huge term.
Yeah, those are good points, Mike. Yeah, I think, it was, right now it's about 60% of the sea level rise we've seen so far has been due to thermal expansion, but that's because it comes in early as a term. It's the concave up term is the ice, and that's a big deal. And on the economic front, I was shocked to learn that the economic models modeled the temperature increase and tried to figure out how much food productivity we'd have from the temperature increase, but they completely ignored the rainfall changes that occur in a disrupted climate. And that actually really devastates the food productivity in a climate disrupted world. That hasn't been put into those economic models. So I think, adding to your argument, Mike, the economists need to sharpen their pencils and really start over when it comes to rainfall as well as temperature.
Yeah, let me, I know a little bit about that. David Battisti, who is a really revered member of our faculty, years ago wrote a paper about the effect on food production of just higher CO2. And I think you all know that under high CO2 conditions, in fact, plants produce less possible human food. Fruit sizes decrease, the wheat production goes down. So Battisti just did a model of food production, but he didn't factor sea level rise into it. And it was already catastrophic just based on the higher CO2 with the lower productivity of the plants. Productivity, at least as far as we humans are involved. But got some smart people on this telecast. I'm curious, what happens if AMOC does stop? So the Atlantic meridional overturning current stops, Europe for the next few centuries gets much cooler. Has anybody modeled that that will be cooling? Now there'll be warming in other areas, but has that been taken into effect by any of the models you've seen? Let's say we turn it off entirely.
Well,
I think you make a point there that's really critical, that when we talk about cooling, we need to make the clear distinction between cooling that involves a redistribution of heat within the planetary system and cooling that is net cooling, where the heat is actually escaping to outer space and the system as a whole is cooling down, because the two things are radically different. Because the idea that you could cool the oceans or any other part of the system and simply shift that heat somewhere else within the system is kind of swings and roundabouts, you know, it's a crazy notion. So there's a very, I think, a really critical distinction to be made there when we talk about cooling.
And well, it's reduced warming, not cooling, but yeah.
Fine. But
I'm going to make another question, and this goes back to Peter's conversation with conservative people. So I'm quite interested in the in the potential of conservative people to get an understanding of sea level rise and to see it as a security problem. And I had a letter published in the Australian newspaper, published by Murdoch, saying that that several meters of sea level rise was possible this century. And the level of mockery and just sarcasm that came from the respondents, they published several letters just saying, you know, I'm a complete idiot, essentially. And so that sort of head in the sand attitude is really very prevalent among the conservative community. But I suppose it's this idea that if we could address sea level rise by increasing albedo, then while allowing emissions to continue, then that is a stratagem that would be attractive to conservative people. But that's a very difficult thing to think through in terms of what it might mean. And I'd be interested, Peter and John, in your thoughts on that.
Getting to the audience is the hardest part. And for instance, I'm sure John will agree with this. We write these books because we thought we were brought up in the system where the best way to get to people is write a book and have your references and have it solid and try to do the best chance you can. And then you write these books and maybe they sell 10,000, maybe 15, maybe 20,000 copies in a world that has over 7 billion people. The books don't do it. I mean, maybe what we ought to do is get Taylor Swift to agree to this and have her do a TikTok, because otherwise we are just not reaching the young people. We're not. I mean, people just don't buy books anymore. We can have this discussion among ourselves. I've noticed that most of us seem to have gray hair, and it's just, it doesn't, well, sorry, but it's true. And it's just not filtering down. I mean, I talked to the college kids. I have 100 kids, and they just look at me and I try to tell them about this stuff and they just sort of shake their head, you know, yeah, boomer, okay, boomer, okay. I don't know. I don't have a solution here, but I know that the message is not filtering out to enough people.
John, any thoughts?
Well, just back on to get sea level rise to stop, we'd have to get back to where the ice sheets would stop melting, Greenland and Antarctica, and that would require the temperature to be sufficiently colder. And we know from historical, some of the things Peter's even talked about today, that you'd have to get well below 280 parts per million of carbon dioxide. You'd have to get global temperature down several degrees, because realizing that
but would you actually have to get could we have a high CO2 world with a high geoengineering world where using the geoengineering to radiate heat to space and to directly freeze the poles?
Well, some of the solutions that I've seen I haven't seen radiating heat to space. I've seen stopping heat with these, reflectors, these particles at L1 or L2 I guess it is that, but I've
Well,
never
there's
seen
marine
a-
cloud brightening and stratospheric aerosol injection would radiate more heat to space, restore
Okay.
planetary albedo.
Okay.
So anyway, let's. Yeah, I think that's a really important debate that we can take on notice. But we've got a couple of other questions and just 20 minutes left. So Herman. So I hope you're unmuting there, Herman.
I am. I'm sorry. I'm on a portable device. Peter, great to see you. Thank you so much for really, as always, a really remarkable input. I just have a quick question, probably to you or anyone else who has a view on it. We're talking here about ice sheet melt and how catastrophic that is for sea level rise. But there's that other melt that's going on, and that's the permafrost, right? So there's this research study that showed a 60-fold increase of thaw slumps in a 10-year period. And I assume that's a 2-year-old article. I assume that's been continuing. But from what I understand, there's, with that particular melt in that same area, just a little bit below, like a third of the world has permafrost or something like that, is the release of methane, of massive increasing numbers of amounts of methane. Any views about that and how that links to sea level rise, how that links to what we're talking about here?
I'm not an expert, but I certainly, the time bomb is methane, all right. And certainly when you have permafrost melting as rapidly as it does, there is so much methane that's locked into those, at least in the high north. I'm much less familiar with southern South America. Certainly I've been all through southern Africa. There's no permafrost down there whatsoever in the whole continent. But the northern hemispheres have so much permafrost. And how much information are we getting out of the ex-Soviet Union? Because they have the biggest land area, and it is the most important, I think, extrusion of clathrates and with methane to the atmosphere is going to be taking place in Russia. And do any of you have communication with our Russian colleagues? It's not as if they like we Americans much anymore.
It's now considered an act of treason for any Russian to transmit data outside of Russia regarding the permafrost. And so sadly, the Woodwell Research Center has had a multi-year program. I will comment that the number of pit craters, the methane pit craters, has been doubling every 1 to 2 years since 2013, to the point where there are more than 1,000 methane pit craters up in the Arctic, not to mention the fact that we've seen submarine pit craters. There's submarine permafrost north of the Siberian Sea and even north of Alaska. And that's melting as well, rather dramatically as the sea warms. You're melting that submarine permafrost maybe even faster than we're melting the terrestrial permafrost.
Yeah. Thank you so much. I am just thinking we need to factor that in. I think as you just pointed out, that level of increase in such short periods of time, and it's continuing, it's accelerating, I think there's a lot of information in that in terms of what we're talking about here. It's just another really critical factor.
By some measures, there's 1,000 gigatons of methane in the permafrost, not to mention the 1,000 gigatons of CO2 we put up. And just think of like 80 times the forcing we have now. That's the potential based on the total methane content.
Thanks,
yes,
Brian.
Another very important topic, Neville.
I'm just a total idiot and stumbled into this call. So, is that none of this feels human? It's like really hard to think about. Like all the scales are beyond human. All the activities that are necessary to meet this stuff are beyond human. And you wonder why people don't want to listen. It's because it's not, it must feel to people that there's nothing for them in it other than the feeling of utter hopelessness. And I think that might that the reaction from the right is a kind of a physiological one. It's like, can I do anything about this? You know, do I understand it? All of these things just hurt people. And so they're reacting, I think, physiologically to it.
That's quite
I don't know
possible.
I don't know if that helps anybody
Yeah,
at
no,
all. But
I just in the last week or two, I remember hearing a very interesting proposition, and that is humanity has no not radically transformed future. In other words, we can either choose to radically transform our behavior now, or nature will radically transform civilizations in the coming decades. There's no non-radical future for humanity. So we just need to wake people up to that idea. Either we change now or nature will change us later. And it starts with food security and famine. We have to address food security needs.
One of the things I put in the chat was it might be worthwhile thinking about a different way to talk about uncertainties. Instead of talking about what's going to, it might be 5 to 10 feet in 2100, as Sean said, or something, to basically say, make the uncertainty about when various amounts of rise are going to occur. We're going to get to one rise, 1 meter rise sometime between whatever, 2050 and 2100 or something. I have different numbers in there. We're going to get to 2 meters sometime between 2100 and 2150 or something. But to talk about it and then to say, so the real uncertainty is not what the numbers are, it's whether your children or your grandchildren are going to experience 1 meter, or your grandchildren and your great-grandchildren are going to experience 2 meters or whatever, and sort of try and get back to the way it's said that the American Indian community thinks of 7 generations, sort of great-grandfather to great-grandchild or something like that, and try and give a sense of what it's going to mean for them and see if you can get their, trigger their moral thinking, a little bit about morality and thinking instead of any other way. So it's just would be a different approach, but to try and give very clear indication, we're going to get to 1 meter. That's not a question. I mean, that's going to happen. And 2 meters or something if we keep going. So try and make that the certainty, and then the time period, the uncertainty.
So we've got 10 minutes to go. I'd just like to recognise that we've got a number of distinguished people on this call, Peter Wadhams, Tom Garreau, Metta Spencer, distinguished in my universe, maybe not distinguished to the broader public, but so I would, in the time that we have remaining, I would welcome if some of the people who haven't spoken just make a comment, even if you don't have a question. But first, we'll just go to Adam Sachs.
Thanks. I have a comment on the non-radical future part, and that is refers back to a discussion that we frequently have at Biodiversity for a Livable Climate, where we're talking about expert opinions on what's going to happen, how fast, and there are so many things happening so fast that there's a proliferation of expert opinions along with the velocity of the things happening that it's really kind of hard to keep track. And so I've suggested a scheme of perhaps guideposts, and that is that we do best practices without regard to outcomes. We know that there's a lot of heat generated from bare land, and there's a lot of upset and disruption from storms, et cetera, and so forth. And if we engage in best practices, such as recreating forests and rebuilding all manner of natural ecosystems that we can have a positive effect. Is it enough of a positive effect to solve all of these problems? No, it might not solve any of them, but we can't do any better than doing what we know are best practices. And there are a lot of them to choose from. Biodiversity for a Livable Climate has recently, in the past 3 years, been doing a lot of work on Miyawaki forests. They're small, but they're biodiverse, and they have a marvelous, very local impact, both on the diversity of species and the cooling that forests have to offer, and revising some of the very difficult and hot things that happen in cities and so forth. So that would be a suggestion for one approach to deciding on what we do. And those things are mostly local. They're mostly inexpensive, and they bring a lot of satisfaction to people who feel stuck in all of this.
We've just got a few minutes left. I'll just check if Peter or John would like to comment on those issues.
I would very briefly, after listening to being part of this talk, and I'm kind of in awe that I was even part of this at all. Why couldn't the 23 of us on this talk at least write one more long letter that we could send to a number of newspapers, or at least something? I mean, we all agree there's a huge problem, and I don't think I'm doing enough to address these problems. But after seeing the talent on this phone call, a letter by all of us can't hurt. I mean, I just feel really stimulated now to try to do something.
Are you gonna write it, Peter?
I'll give a rough draft and then run it by you folks, and maybe we can make it work. I don't know. I hear people in this talk who've written letters, and what happens? I get it. There's a lot of hitting back, but I feel like if knowing the problem and not doing something about it every day is probably not the best way for me to live.
And organizing is helpful as well. Peter, if you could unmute, please.
Oh,
Peter,
sorry.
No, that's Peter Wadhams I'm talking to.
Oh, okay. Excuse me.
If you can find the button, which is going down to the bottom of the screen under the bottom, usually the bottom left has got mute.
Robert, if you're the moderator, you can unmute him.
I can, that's right, of course. Thank
you. Made it. Okay, in the last minute, I wonder if I could say something, which is to really reinforce the comment that was made earlier on.
Sorry, Peter, is it possible to put your video back on?
He was there.
Yes, okay. And in the last minute, I'd like to say half a minute, say something which I think is very, very important, but was passed over very briefly, which is methane. And this is not just another thing that we have to think about. It's possibly the most important and major item that's threatening us at the moment, and that was the fact that firstly the people who are working on methane, which started out being the Russians mainly, were discovering that very large quantities of methane are coming out of the ocean, and especially the shallow waters of the ocean, and there's a lot of those around. Then we have, in fact, what later came about after that was the very large quantities of methane coming out of land, and with these these big methane bursts. And so you put that all together, and you're dealing with a material which is not easy to get rid of. It's not going to be just go away. And we've got to consider how much of the forthcoming warming, the forthcoming increase in global temperatures and increase in global gases is methane. We shouldn't just think about it as an afterthought, but we have to consider that this is maybe one of our major enemies to tackle.
Thank you, Peter. And one of the issues with methane is that the IPCC considers a 100-year horizon, where the 10 or 20-year horizon is vastly worse in terms of its heat impact. And so the various short-term heat impacts from methane, from aerosols, are what's causing the extraordinary spike in recent temperatures.
Yes, exactly.
Now we've just got a couple of minutes left, and so I'd like to invite Peter and John to give some concluding comments. So I did want to just refer back to Peter's status as an extinction expert, and his analysis of the Permian event is, I think, very concerning for our current situation in this sixth extinction context, and things like the ocean stratification that could cause vast belches of hydrogen sulfide. Now that may be a slower concern, but it's the sort of planetary sensitivity, planetary fragility context that we really need to understand in terms of global thinking. So I'll invite Peter and John to provide final comments, please.
John, go ahead. I defer to your wisdom.
No, I have no greater wisdom than yours. You know, I think plain language is important, and unfortunately, from my experience, being quite direct with people about, you know, saying that sea level is going to rise, and I think we have to be more assertive about it. That we really have passed the point when we can stop sea level at the current level. It's been there for 6,000 years. We know historically it goes up and down 120 meters, 400 feet. Most people don't know that. Even teaching them some basic, geologic history awakens us to realize that the shoreline is not permanent. It never was, in fact. So that's kind of the attitude I use.
Thank you, John.
I'd like to finish up with a thought I started with. What's an Earth-like planet? And this is something that, again, you have to think about time and space, but especially let's think about time. What we think is an Earth-like planet is a planet that has been going in and out of glacial cycles. And what we are doing to the planet now is getting rid of the glacial cycles, clearly. I mean, if we continue on this particular CO2 binge that we're on, we're not going to have a next Pleistocene glacial advance that I can tell. And we consider Earth-like to be that Ice Age planet. Well, we've got to get prepared for an Eocene-like planet. And I think it behooves all of us to yell as loud as we can. What was that great movie, Network? I'm mad as hell and I'm not going to take it anymore. And it's got to be yelled.
Thank you very much, Peter. Thank you, John. Thank you, everyone, for joining the call. It's been recorded, and we'll put it up on the Healthy Planet Action Coalition website, and I'll also circulate a YouTube version of the talk. So I appreciate your participation, and we'll conclude at that point.
Thanks for organizing it. Thanks.
One last thing I do have, if anybody wants my PowerPoint, I will send it in, and you can use any of these slides anytime you want.
Thanks. Thank you,
That's
Peter.
great, Peter. Thank you.
Bye.
All right. Bye-bye.
All right. Cheers.
Thank you, Peter.